I've not had these successes because I'm the world's best bike rider. Yeah, you've got to be able to do that core skill set. It's actually being able to drive the projects. It's actually having the wider skill set to go, what is the art of the possible here? Who do I need to make this happen?
For more than 15 years, Mark Beaumont has shared the stories of his endurance adventures, right from his first BBC film when cycling around the world.
When I got into this game in 2006, you could literally walk into the canteen. I was a student in the West End of Glasgow. You could literally walk into the BBC canteen and chat to people as they had their lunch.
I wanted to ask about the adventure of becoming an adventure athlete.
Lots of people broke my record, and yet very few people know who they are. I always felt sorry for them, riding a phenomenal race over 18,000 miles and then assuming that they'd be given the same career and opportunities that I was when I came back from my first trip, but not understanding that racing around the planet and breaking the record is in itself a different thing. That is simply the passport to then be allowed to build other business strands around what you do.
Mark explains the business of professional endurance athleticism.
If you're going to go out year on year and take on major expeditions and build broadcast projects, they're all startups. You've got to build the finance, recruit the team, build the brand. And I understood from that first expedition that doing the feat was very different than telling the story.
And the next story to tell?
Race across America, 3,100 miles from California across to the east, is widely considered the biggest endurance bike race out there. It's nearly 40 years old. There's never been a British winner.
I hope this is going to be a rather different podcast with Mark Beaumont. I've heard him interviewed many times. I've linked to some in the show notes because he's very good at what he does, utterly professional. And that's what I hope to explore. Mark has just released a new podcast, linked to a book, which will be out soon. And while listening to the first episode, I completely changed my plan for this interview. Rather than ask him to tell about one of his adventures, I thought I'd ask about the big adventure, that of becoming such a successful, well-known endurance athlete. I checked he was happy with the change of tack, and to his credit, he said no topics are off limits. So, my first question, when did he start to think he could make a career out of this?
That's a good place to start. I can't remember a moment where I thought, I'm going to make a career out of adventure and broadcasting and all the things I do. I had the first acorn of an idea, and to be honest with you, I felt that it was a post-university adventure to get out my system, and then I would go back and work in finance and do what I was meant to do with an economics degree. And it was only through that journey that I ended up absolutely loving not just the expedition, which I kind of knew I would, but also the broadcast elements of it. And I think any career, entrepreneurial career, you can only ever see the next horizon. And looking back on the last 15 years, it looks wonderfully inevitable and wonderfully sure-footed, but that's not how it feels when you live it.
I was thinking like footprints in the snow. You can only see the path when you turn around and look behind you.
Yeah.
We know that age 12 you famously headed off across Scotland on your bike. Now you're not that old. This wasn't the golden mythical age of the 1930s when people called in at Crofts for a cuppa. Weren't you worried about doing that? Not the point, weren't your parents worried about you doing that?
I mean, I think at the age of 12, you don't have any real context in terms of, risk or, what it is. If you've got an idea, you just want to do it. I mean, I've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I love childhood ambitions because they're limitless. And, it's up to a parent to build a framework around that and to do things safely. So, I mean, yes, if you stand somewhere high, you'll feel scared. But apart from those sort of natural trepidations around being cold, being high, being this, being that, you need to teach young people to be scared of other things. So you're never going to be scared of going on a journey. That's quite exciting. So to understand the risk profile and what that took, there was nothing about that scared me in the slightest. In fact, I had no reference point to what that would be, mainly because I'd been homeschooled until that age. I hadn't really traveled that far by any means. And the idea to go from Dundee to Oban across Scotland seemed like, a good fun trip. Well, the truth of the matter is I read in the local paper, the Dundee Courier, about somebody who had gone end to end, John O'Groats to Land's End, and I thought, I want to do that. And Mum said, "Well, look, why don't you try something smaller first?" Because you've not really cycled off the farm before, and that's where the Across Scotland came from. So my mum's always been a great supporter. She doesn't have that big sort of cycling or expedition background, but she's always been, I guess it comes from having the courage to homeschool your own children. She was always quite keen that we learned to explore and, learn our own minds. So she was very happy to support me on that early venture. And, that was age 12. 10 years later, I was off to cycle around the world. And that sounds a bit glib, but, if imagine my mum at that point had said, "Don't be stupid," it's very unlikely 10 years later I would have the skill set, the confidence to do the ultimate in the world.
I was still at BBC Scotland when David Peat came up to me, and I think I'd done some film on Hamish McInnes, and he told me about you and what you were doing. And did you at any stage think, "Wow, what a springboard to a career, a BBC series, if we can get that out of this"?
That's not the way I saw it at the time. I mean, I was absolutely relieved, but I didn't walk into BBC Scotland as it was in Queen Margaret Drive and meet David Peat over lunch because I wanted to be in telly, which sounds weird, but David Peat was a great mentor of mine. The great late David Peat. I mean, he was such a creative, such a kind man, so fascinated in human stories. And what he taught me really in the last 6 years of his career and the first 6 years of mine was that great interest in people, in capturing life on film. And I got the opportunity to film all over the planet with him. But when I first walked in, then you've got to understand, I was a poor student. I was a graduate with an economics degree thinking I can't afford to take on my dream, which was to cycle around the world. It was going to cost me £25,000. And it was a very simple sum. I need to somehow convince media to cover this journey, to create some profile around the trip. And I need to, give the reassurance to the people who are ultimately going to pay for this that it's going to be, it's going to be widely known about. So you can't
just getting a meeting so you could walk into Queen Margaret Drive.
Well, you can't do that now because now it's down at Pacific Quay. They've got security gates. So when I got into this game in 2006, you could literally walk into the canteen. So I was a student in the West End of Glasgow. You could literally walk into the BBC canteen and chat to people as they had their lunch. So back then it wasn't a problem. Whereas and you've got to have the confidence to do that. You've got to have the confidence to walk in and chat to people and introduce yourself. Whereas you just can't do that now. You need to have a formal introduction and whatnot. So. Times have changed. David Peat took a risk, but I mean, that first documentary, The Man Who Cycled the World, it was a 1-page agreement between us. They gave me a camera. David Peat, took it on his own really to film elements before I left and then on the road, but I wasn't paid a penny for it. So, I wasn't, and I didn't have any rights for it. So as a broadcast deal, it was extraordinary looking back. It was the launch pad at the start of my career, because it's one thing breaking a world record, but then it's another thing 3 months later when you've got a 4-part as it was, BBC One documentary series that was shown on BBC Scotland and then network. It opened a lot of doors, but I would be lying to say that I planned all that. What was in my mind when I left Glasgow University was, I can't afford this, and if I'm going to bring on people to afford it, I need to somehow create profile around it. It was a very economic sum. I had no interest in being on telly. It was just a case of, okay, let's somehow get this thing off the ground. And then after the event and meeting David Peat, he really shared with me that passion, that living journeys and having the opportunity to share it with, huge audiences, what happens in real time collected for screen time. And I've ended up, really thriving on that. It's a hugely important part of what I do now, but it wasn't there at the start. It was a very simple economic sum.
Technically, it was incredibly pioneering, because this you could do on an iPhone now, probably what you were doing then, but you had camera and you're holding it at arm's length and back as you're pedaling, and the selfie thing. And
Mhm.
everybody takes that for granted now, but that could not have been easy, just managing the batteries, just managing the tapes, because it's tape in those days.
So yeah, we were. I mean, cracky, it does make me sound old. I mean, I'm 37, but that was 30. So what was that? So
I think
2006,
2006, I think.
2007, I was out there.
Yeah.
And, so I was in the middle of Iran, couriering back mini DVs. I was in the middle of Australia, wherever I was. And, there's no way of backing that up. So you're just hoping it makes it back to Glasgow to be made into and mini DVs, if nobody ever saw them, was like small cassette tapes. And it was only really 2-3 years after that everything went digital. And I mean, that was pre-social media. So, I would be in my tent at night, recounting the stories of the day, and then everything was told afterwards. So I lived this journey for half a year, riding 100 miles a day for half a year, and then the documentary came out afterwards. I got the opportunity to write my first book on a nationwide talk tour. But you live the journey and then you tell the story. Whereas then just 2 years later, when I set out on the Americas expedition again with BBC Scotland, everything was told in real time. Suddenly Twitter was a thing, and it was I was riding with a BGAN, which is a mobile satellite dish, strapped onto my bicycle, so I could do live feeds from the top of mountains to Jackie Bird back in. It's just extraordinary how in 2-3 short years things moved. But I knew very little when I set out on that first trip. They said, David said, and Neil MacDonald and the team there said, if you do well, if this goes to plan, then we'll make a half-hour BBC Scotland doc out of it. So it was a very low bar. I mean, I was out there for half a year, 18,000 miles. There was days I would sit in my tent and chat to the camera for half an hour because, the camera was my buddy on the road. It was the only thing to share the journey with. So very quickly, by the time I got to Istanbul at the end of leg one, David was saying, okay, we've got so much footage, and you seem to be quite good at capturing the moment and turning the camera, not just when things are going well, but when they're going badly, that we're going to make more of this. And then when I came back, it was a 4-part series. And then, it got picked up and went out on network. So it grew arms and legs, but I set out with very sort of modest ambitions, a half-hour BBC Scotland doc, and what it became was obviously something much greater.
Between the two round the worlds, that one and the amazing 2017 record-breaking one, you squeezed in a heck of a lot, and 2 of them were in a rowing boat, not a bike. I mean, you were trying to reach the magnetic North Pole, and I think you were filming that, weren't you? And then the following year, you were trying to do a transatlantic record. Now, I remember Alistair Humphreys in his podcast told me ocean rowing was the most horrible thing he has ever done, yet you went back for more. And I'm wondering why you did that. Were you trying to work out what kind of adventurer you were? Was it just cycling, or did you want to do other things?
So after having cycled around the world and top to bottom from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, the dream that I had, which stuck with me for years until 2012, was to do a full man-powered circumnavigation. So how fast can you go across the continents and across the oceans? So unlike Al, I mean, Al's a great buddy of mine, and we've known each other for a long time, but we're very different athletes. In fact, he probably wouldn't even describe himself as an athlete. He's an adventurer. He goes out and he has these amazing adventures, and he doesn't train professionally. He doesn't take on these things to do firsts or fastest. In fact, he would sort of argue that spoils the point in these great journeys. So we always have fun with the fact that we're so different. So I've always been in a hurry. I've always been trying to have that fine balance between what is physiologically, psychologically possible, what is my personal best, but also where can it take you? That amazing view on the world when you're taking on these wonderfully intense journeys. So I'd be a rubbish nomadic traveler, which is what Al is. But where I agree with Al is that ocean rowing is purgatory. It's really pretty mind numbing. I mean, I know a lot of ocean rowers who absolutely love that space, and mariners, but I think what had always appealed to me was when you're on the bike or you're doing land-based expeds, every day is different. It can be hard, but there's always the change. That sort of slideshow view of the world as you sort of pedal yourself across continents. Whereas the oceans, they're big waves and little waves. It's like the great polar expeditions. there's very little change between today, tomorrow, and next week. And that lack of change means that all the arrows, if you imagine, are pointing in the way. There's no arrows pointing back into the world. And so if you imagine that as your interest in psychology, but also in terms of where you're pointing the camera, there's very little to point the camera at. There's very little to point your interest at. So it becomes entirely about your suffering, your perseverance, your physical battles. So I was on this journey to try and learn the skill set to do a complete circumnavigation, the Atlantic, the Indian, and the Pacific Ocean. And the Arctic for me was my first apprenticeship. BBC Scotland asked me to go and film an expedition called Rowing the Arctic because they needed a cameraman who could also be the athlete on board. So amazing place to learn to row. And, it wasn't my expedition. I was simply there to be an equal member of the team, 1/6 of the team, but also to film that story. There was no other crew. It was my job to film it. So technically, a big step up in terms of my filmmaking career. A lot of training and time went into that. But I loved it because the Arctic was a coastal expedition through the islands and the ice fields of the Nunavut territory of Canada. There was constant beauty and change, and the high Arctic in the middle of summer is a place to experience. It's, midday looks like midnight. And yet 5-6 months later, when I then went into the Atlantic, I lost all of that. I lost that sense of change and purpose. And I actually decided firmly about 1,000 miles in the middle of the Atlantic, I'm not going to do this. This big dream of mine, which had happened for 6 years to do the entire circumnavigation. I messaged back to Nikki, she was my fiance at the time, and said, I'm not going to do the world, which might sound sort of glib now, but at the time that was a massive deal because whilst it wasn't public knowledge, it was everything I was working towards, to join it up. I'd cycled around the world. Now what would it take to cross the oceans? But fundamentally, if you don't enjoy it, you can't do these things. You can suffer, but only if you somehow enjoy that space. And then when we capsized and very nearly died 28 days into the Atlantic, that was definitely the full stop. I was going to say nail in the coffin, but that would be the wrong phrase. But it was, I'd long decided before that I wasn't getting out of ocean rowing what I expected. It wasn't the same thing. And I let go of that dream. And I always thought if I let go of the dream to do the full circumnavigation, which, let's not forget, is the ultimate. How fast can you humanly get around the planet, land and ocean? It's yet to be done. Well, there's a reason it's not been done, but to do it properly, people have done variations on it, but a proper non-stop human-based circumnavigation, to go through antipodal points, to travel 24,900 miles, whatever the equator is, it's an extraordinarily difficult journey. And I was on that journey, but I decided for very good reason not to not to see it through.
This is going to be quite a long question, so forgive me. I don't like long questions, but it needs a little bit of a setup. Something that fascinates me is all the other strings you need to have on your bow if you're going to do this as you do. I was looking at your website, which describes you as an athlete, broadcaster, and ambassador. On Twitter, you're a documentary and podcast maker, author, speaker, and investor. On LinkedIn, you're an investment fund partner, a business mentor, and a part-time athlete and broadcaster. Now, I love these facts are different facets of the same person. And I could ask you loads of questions about each and every one of those, especially the investment side of things, because that's what you were going to do initially. But they point to all these multiple supplemental skills you need to make it as a professional. How important is it to have all of these income streams, shall we say, and how difficult are they to acquire? Because you wouldn't have known this when you came back from that first round the world.
No, not at all. No, I guess I made a lot of mistakes in those first few years. I was thrown into having a public profile. I was suddenly doing, big billboard adverts and, writing books and doing, my first national talk tour was like 60 venues.
Okay, well, what was that like? What was it like in the early days of public speaking? What were you like? I actually saw you, so I'm not going to say what I thought, but you tell me what you thought. What was it like from your side?
Well, if you can imagine going from pulling pints in a bar in Glasgow, earning £5 an hour, to then suddenly, being fought over for book deals and to be out on nationwide tours and be offered lucrative, commercial deals for brand work. I'm not pretending the last 15, 16 years has always been like that. But when you're, you have moments in your career when you achieve, when you have moments in the limelight, then suddenly there can be extraordinary opportunities. And how to manage the business and manage your brand and decide what you want to do and keep the purpose within what you do.
And be good. I bet you'd be insistent that you didn't just take it and go with anybody. You'd want to do whatever you did well, I'm certain.
Well, actually, having a good background in economics and politics is quite useful. It might sound like an odd transition, but you understand opportunity cost. You understand the value of your time and profile. Having an interest in politics. You get a sense of the lay of the land in the world, and you've got an interest outside of, if you think of in terms of impact, what's the impact you want to create on the world? Family, work, community, be that sort of charities and education. I had a clear idea from the start. If I was going to build my own career, and that had to be a portfolio career, insofar as I knew from the start, it's not like you're lottery funded, or if you're going to be a professional adventure athlete, there's some infrastructure and you're just paid to be an athlete. It's not that simple. If you're going to go out year on year and take on major expeditions and build broadcast projects, they're all startups. You've got to build the finance, recruit the team, build the brand. And I understood from that first expedition that doing the feat was very different than telling the story. So in the 10 years between the first time round and the second time round, lots of people broke my record, and yet very few people know who they are, because I always felt sorry for them riding a phenomenal race over 18,000 miles and then assuming that they'd be given the same career and opportunities that I was when I came back from my first trip, but not understanding that racing around the planet and breaking the record is in itself a different thing. That is simply the passport to then be allowed to build other business strands around what you do. So, of course, for people who are just following on the BBC or reading my books, I look like the guy who's never got a job. I always joke that, my father still doesn't think I have got a job. But the fundamental truth is, to even get to the start line on these projects and to sustain it, not just once after university, but year after year after year for what has been now, 15 plus years, you've got to build, a growth business. You've got to have different strands. You've got to have an idea of your own sort of time commitments. And as I say, the opportunity cost around those things. And I go back to that first year when I came back. I hated writing at university. I'd always choose an exam over an essay. And I was suddenly asked to write a book. And I thought that the publishers would hold my hand, and that would be a very sort of, I would just tell the story and somebody would help me write it. Not at all. They said 5 months, go away, get it done, don't be late. And my first talk tour, to, as I say, a couple of months on the road, back to back to back to back, 6 nights a week telling my story, I think I was pretty sort of rabbits in the headlight. It was an extraordinary amount of, there was no social media. So I guess I was lucky that wasn't sort of a thing in podcasting, but there was still a huge amount of attention for my time. And I was trying to figure out how to manage all this. And I definitely made a lot of mistakes, but I also learned early on that I really enjoyed all those elements. There's a lot of people in the adventure world who have had a career first and then come into it because they didn't like their corporate lives. So it's on almost sort of an anti-establishment sort of, I'm leaving that behind and I'm going to, not quite live in a cabin, but I'm going with that. And I've never been that. So I've never written a CV. I've never been in a job interview. I've never been employed in that sense. From the day I left university, I've been trying to create the opportunities to take on my biggest dreams, to partner with causes that I'm passionate about in education and charity. And as the responsibilities have grown around sort of family and kids and whatnot, to build a bit more security around it. Because when you're in your 20s and you've got an entrepreneurial career like this, you can have these incredible peaks and troughs and it doesn't really matter. Whereas when time goes on and you build a team around you and you've got employees and you've got wider responsibilities, there has to become a point where there's a bit more strategy around where's this going. It's not just every 18 months having a new startup and you're back to square one. So I've enjoyed it. I've loved it. But I do think that when people meet me now, they see quite a secure business. They see the profile that I've created and the opportunities I've got. I always joke now that I spend half my life in a suit and half my life in lycra, but like it is an odd career to have ended up with when I spend a lot of my time investing and building early stage businesses and a lot of my time making films and doing things like free riding down volcanoes. But it's a remarkably similar skill set, actually. But behind the scenes, you've still got to,
Really?
yeah.
You've got to explain. I mean, I have questions to ask you, but you've got to explain that one.
Before you get to take on these big projects, you need to be able to raise finance, build teams, create tight timelines around success, and then share your stories in a meaningful way to significant audiences. So whether you're talking about business or expeditions, I think the old familiarity bias with athletes and adventure athletes is, well, I'm a bike rider, so I'll just ride my bike. I'm very keen to say, I've not had these successes because I'm the world's best bike rider. The success is, yeah, you've got to be able to do that core skill set. It's actually being able to drive the projects. It's actually having the wider skill set to go, what is the art of the possible here? Who do I need to make this happen? I think there's a lot of bike riders out there who could beat my Around the World in 80 Days project. But, I employed 40 people on that project. It costs in cash and in kind £1 million. And it took 2.5 years of strategy and planning. So being a good bike rider is one part of the equation, which is often missed when you then watch it. If you read the book, it just looks like one bloke on his push bike for 80 days.
No. Well, no, it doesn't. I listened to your. Actually, I listened to the audio book of your 78-day record, and that I have to say the audio book is fantastic because you're mixing in there the videos that you've recorded at the time, and you've
That's
got
right.
you reading your story, and you've got the audio from the time, and it's absolutely fantastic. And I'd urge people to listen to that if they haven't got it because it's so good. Or you also did an American podcast recently where you talked about this challenge. But one question I would really like to know is how you went about, and you touched on this with the Greg White podcast, how you went about getting the right people for that challenge, not just the logistics that give you motorhomes on different continents, the 7 bikes and all of that. How did you know you had the right people or the people that you needed at the right time? And by and large, they would get along.
I'll try and keep that one concise.
You keep it
It's,
about 40 minutes, yeah.
I mean, I don't think I did get it perfectly right. I would never claim that. The human element, the HR is always the hardest part, and we're all imperfect, and we all have good days and bad days, and the untold pressure from performance at this very pointy end, sleep deprivation, just the stress of what we were trying to pull off was extraordinary. I mean, you could see that in real terms with myself every morning doing my saliva samples. You could see my cortisol level, my stress hormone was through the roof. But I mean, I'm sure it was the same for the rest of my team. And that behavioral change under pressure, how people are not just during the interview process, but how they are halfway around the planet when you've only slept for 5 hours a night and everything's going wrong. It's extraordinary what character traits it brings out, that degree of focus and living in close confines with each other. I mean, I guess for my part, doing a lot of mountaineering and ocean rowing and team expeditions have taught me the value of that, and having, good self-awareness in team dynamics and listening and thinking before you speak and all those sort of simple traits. But I mean, I selected the basic team in terms of my performance, my logistics, and my media. But then it was up to my managers to then select their teams and so on. So by the time we got to racing around the world, I made it very clear that I had one job, and that was to ride the bike. And it was up to my team to get me around the planet. Because you can't micromanage a project on this scale from the bike. I've got a big enough job to do. So you've got to trust. You've got to hand over the reins. You've got to really, trust in the process that you've put in place and the people that you've given those opportunities to. And that's hard when it means so much to you, when you've got so much invested personally and financially, to then live it and realize that other people have got different ways of operating and don't always agree with the way you work, but knowing that everyone's ultimately bought into the big dream, what you're trying to do. And I think the interesting part within that question is nobody else would have come up with a plan. Nobody else would have come up with a plan to go around the world in 80 days. They're trusting my ability, my life journey, and my ambition that you can do something on this scale, break the previous world record by nearly 40%. And within that, I always felt that my team looked at me and every day said, can we do this? Are we up to the task? They knew what to do in a nuts and the bolts sense. They knew their job, but the scale of what it stacked up to be, that was my dream. And you shoulder a lot of responsibility at the heart of a project when you're the one that sets your team up to task.
I wonder if you're still recovering from that.
I'm on good terms with all the team. But I know I put them through everyone's so proud of what we pulled off there. And it was
Rightly.
A massive we. But to go back to your very original, point in terms of, what will come next, I would love to see how that could be broken. I'd love to see what it would take, what combination of crew, logistics, support, ability, belief systems, like what would allow you to get around the planet faster? You're not going to break that record by another 37% for sure, but it's definitely beatable. But it's whoever takes up the mantle, I've got a huge amount of respect for, because man, you've got to be able to go really, really deep.
How do you find the time to stay fit? Because I see you're out most days running. You're doing a lot of running at the moment. And are you still happy? You're under 40. Is your body still performing as highly as you'd wish it to?
Yeah, I feel pretty strong. This year I've run more than ever. Actually, it's probably a reaction to 2020. And initially when lockdown happened in March, I think it was, and we weren't allowed to go out. So my plans for the year, which was things like Race Across America, a big 3,000-mile race, and others, were obviously binned. And it wasn't practical and responsible to go out and do long training rides and what I'm usually doing. So I took it upon myself during lockdown to do a project with my daughter, she was 6 at the time, but she's now just turned 7, Harriet. And I was listening to the Rick Roll podcast in America, Rich Roll, and he was interviewing Ricky Gates, who's a US ultra runner who had run across America, but then thought, well, I don't really know home, and he decided to run every street in San Francisco. And I thought, this sounds quite neat. So week 1 of lockdown, I got the A to Z of Edinburgh and I mapped it out, and I thought, well, Edinburgh, according to my crude sums, was about 80 10K runs. And we're allowed to exercise an hour a day with family. So I set out with my 6-year-old daughter. So she was on her bicycle and I was running, and it was like a giant puzzle, and we colored it in like with a highlighter pen each evening. And we ended up spending over 100 hours together running and cycling every single street in Edinburgh, every cul-de-sac. And, talk about familiarity bias. I thought I knew Edinburgh because of where my friends and family live. And when you get to see every estate, everything, it's an extraordinary insight into the communities that you live and what's close to home, and to have those conversations with your 6-year-old daughter. There's 100 hours of quality time, which I never would have otherwise have. So yeah, I've managed to carry some of that running fitness, mainly because I just didn't have the same need to ride my bike. So I have been out shooting some films in Scotland over the last couple of months since things have started to ease. And I keep fit through doing something, at least 6 days a week. But it's a tricky balance. I've just written another book. I commit about half my working life to the investing side of my business. So with young family, it's busy.
Is your diet plant-based? Sorry, that shouldn't come from anywhere, but I was just thinking about the New Zest stuff you were doing, because I want to go on and talk about your podcast, which is sponsored by them. Are you plant-based, or is it just that you're using their products?
I'm not purely plant-based. There's periods in my career where I've been plant-based. I would describe myself as an omnivore, but I only ever eat anything meat-based if I know exactly where it's come from. I think in terms of what you put in your body, it's, if things have come through factories or abattoirs, or it's some of the most processed foods on the shelves. So I care deeply about sort of natural foods and the quality of the food, and the source of the food. For practical and ethical terms, I've been through quite a journey over the last 15 years. Through my student life, I was mainly vegetarian. And I would say I'm mainly a plant-based athlete, although I don't fit into any one bracket or bucket. I'm not vegan or vegetarian. I would describe myself as an incredibly picky meat eater because I enjoy eating almost anything as long as I know exactly where it's come from. So quality matters. The origin of the food matters more
That's
than
pretty much what Donny Campbell was saying to me on our last podcast. He's very similar. He wouldn't turn it down if a friend had made some really nice stuff. But
yeah.
yeah.
And Donny's, I didn't know he'd had Donny on. Donny's a mate of mine. We've done a bunch of stuff. What a phenomenal athlete.
Yeah, Donny's a friend of mine, actually. It was my wife's kayak that got him across the Sound of Mull, and I've filmed quite a lot of his stuff. I was filming him for the adventure show. So,
Super.
yeah, but I was doing it anyway. I was filming him anyway. And then they came along and said, "Oh, right, can we do a bit of that?" No, he's a good friend. So let's talk about your new podcast, Endurance, and the book that's coming out soon with the same title. Now, it starts with the three great endurance cyclists, but it's much more than that. So could you tell me a little bit about where it's going to go to?
Yeah, so I was asked at the start of the year to write a book about endurance cycling. There's been such a move, a culture shift, if you like, in the last 5 years away from sort of road racing and more to do with just experiential riding. So people getting into gravel and endurance road, and I just think even bikes by design these days are more built for, as I sort of joke and say, the Mark Beaumonts of this world rather than the Mark Cavendishes. So I think there's been a culture shift in cycling, and I was asked to write a book about the skill set, the toolkit that allows people to endure, to go and push their ambitions in adventure sport and cycling. So that I sort of thought, well, I can do that because I've done that my entire life since I was a 12-year-old kid pedaling across Scotland. But there's a heck of a lot I don't know. So in the process of writing the book, I thought, why don't I speak to a lot of the experts, the people I respect most in this space, and sort of weave in their wise words. And I thought, well, the best and most interesting way of doing that, because I enjoy listening to podcasts, would be to record those conversations. And, we can never put out the entire conversation in the book. And the podcast recordings were, in a sense, my research for the book. So as a listener, you can listen into Endurance and think, wow, this is a podcast series. But it's also interesting when you think of it as a research project for writing a book. And then when the book comes out, these will be written up in interesting ways and literally in boxed out sections. If we're talking about, recovery, I might be talking to a sleep specialist, or if you're talking about, the science of endurance, I'm talking about a physiologist talking about the hormonal difference between male and female athletes. Or I guess we've got about, out of the series of 25 podcasts, we've got 2 or 3 with athletes, people you might know the names of, but the rest are people you'll have never heard of because they're the sports scientists, the experts, the geeks, if you like, who are behind the athletes and are really shifting the dial in terms of what endurance sports is. So I thought by speaking to those people, I'd fill in all the gaps, the information I don't know. And what I really want to do is just put out credible, interesting, engaging information to give people the confidence that I've built over the last 15, 20 years to go out and push yourselves, whether that is, riding a century or pedaling around the planet. It doesn't really matter. They're equally difficult depending on your experience.
And it was interesting listening to you talking to Greg White, trying to define endurance, actually.
Yeah, exactly. What is endurance? So I've loved it. It's been very self-indulgent. I've, over the last 3-4 months, got to write the book and interview a lot of very interesting people. I've enjoyed it.
Will you be going back to race across America, do you think, when that comes back on? And will you be doing that to win, to set a new record? Because I think that 2004 record there is still standing for the team of 4. How would you do it?
I've got to that point in my career where the round the world in 80 days felt like my Everest. I don't think there's anything harder or bigger in terms of ultra endurance. It is the world. I grew up inspired by Ellen MacArthur and her sailing around the world, and it's the equivalent. I've always wondered why the circumnavigation is not seen as the biggest endurance cycle event out there, and hopefully the 80 days in some ways gives it that space. But having said that, I've never stood on the start line. I've never raced in a traditional sense of the word. So having had the opportunity to do all these mega expeditions, the length of the Americas, Cairo to Cape Town, around the world twice, and whatnot, I don't at this point have that itch to scratch, but I would like to turn my attention to some of the world's most iconic endurance events and just see if my skill set and my experience, for my own interest as much as anything else, is relevant to these races and events. So, Race Across America, 3,100 miles from California across to the east, is widely considered the biggest endurance bike race out there. And it's nearly 40 years old. There's never been a British winner. And my approach was year one to race it as a pair. So you're riding in relay, and then take that learning experience and then go for it for the big solo. Now the fastest teams, as you alluded to, are the fours, but I've got no real ambitions to join a team of four. My strength's very much in the more sort of solo endurance space. I would never be the speed merchant that's needed to do. When you're doing fours going across America, you're basically doing 15-minute time trial sections. I mean, I would, here in the tortoise, I've just never been that fast. Whereas my ability to keep going and, win these big records over utter consistency and long distances, I think would bode quite well for RAM. But I don't take it for granted. It's an incredibly difficult event.
And that would interest you more than something like the self-supported Transcontinental or GB Duro?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I would love to get back to doing some unsupported expeditions. I mean, I absolutely loved the length of Africa, which was exactly that, unsupported, 160 miles a day, bike packing, carrying all my own kit. Having pushed myself to the extremes that I have, around the world was 240 miles a day, there's an element where I'm not sure I want to. It's a sliding scale, isn't it? If you take yourself, I know I can ride well north of 200 miles a day, but you go into idiot mode. You go into this very, very sleep deprived, difficult state. If it was adventure racing, I wouldn't mind it quite so much. But on the road, I've got a massive amount of respect for those that do the transcontinental. You heard me on my podcast talking to the likes of Fiona Colbinger and James Hayden. Do I want to do that? I've done so much riding in a similar space. I almost wouldn't want to take myself to that extreme without a support team with me. And for me, and this is a very personal point, it's about safety. I think if I was doing adventure racing off-road, I would quite happily go bike packing and carry my own kit and whatnot. But I almost, I don't know, I'm thinking aloud here. Would I trust myself to not try and go to the depths I did with the Round the World in 80 days, but you suddenly just don't have a performance team behind you telling you you're pushing it too hard, this is not sustainable, you're not safe on the road anymore? It's a very, very personal point, because that's not a wider criticism of people who do those races. I just feel like I've taken myself to such an extreme. I don't want to go back to that same extreme, but without the safety net of a performance team.
I think it's one of the things, speaking to people like Josh Ibbott in his podcasts, that they have to know when to stop and when to say, no, actually, I'm going to stop now because I'm either not getting safe or I need some more energy. I need the energy that sleep will bring. And that in itself is a winning skill, actually.
Of course it is. And of course, I'll have some of that experience as well from what I've done. I think the other element is you've really got to want to do it. You've got to really want to suffer. And I think I've suffered so much with the races I've been on. The idea, it's got to be new enough and different enough to want to take myself back there. The idea of doing a shorter version of something I've already done to win a race just doesn't appeal at all. RAM for me is distinct enough. It's different enough. GB Duro would be very different, would be very challenging. I think I'd quite enjoy that. I've not given that the space it deserves, so I've not taken it on yet. So I'm not ruling it out, but I don't think the likes of Transcontinental would appeal to the same degree, because it would just feel like a version of what I've done. So a lot of suffering without a different enough challenge.
Listening to the first podcast, you talked about almost the responsibilities that come with the position you're in. You're rector of Dundee University, you're patron of the Saltire Foundation, bunch of other charities, Orchid Studio, Archery Foundation, and more. You gave time to talk to me, and you talk to other podcasts. You don't have to do that. Why do you do all of that? And I suspect you might say it's to give something back, but I think that's too easy an answer. Why really do you do it?
That's a good question. Ever since I was 12 years old, there's always been a community aspect to my rides, my projects. So going back to that very formative journey, pedaling across Scotland, going door to door, fundraising, around Blairgowrie, and then buying a horse box for the International League for the Protection of Horses and handing over a check to Princess Royal for Save the Children. All of these journeys, with the solo exception of the BBC ones where I wasn't allowed to have a charitable link for their reasons, have had another purpose to it. And I've always been very clear. I've not had a career of charity bike rides because that shifts the narrative. It actually starts to devalue what you're doing. So I've always said, like, I'm a professional athlete. I'm out there to do the things I'm passionate about, create interesting content, be that documentaries, book, talk tours, the rest of it. But there's the opportunity with all of these things to create, overflow, to create ripples, to create impact. Why do you do it? I mean, I think it's a habit. Yes, there's a thing of like, I know how to do it and therefore I do it. I've got the network to do these things. I enjoy it. But again, back to your question, that's too simple, isn't it? I think it comes back to a very personal sense of purpose. I get an extraordinary access to all sorts of businesses and organizations. Last year I did 130 events. I got to see well over 100 different organizations, commercial, third sector, whatnot, schools. When you see so many people leading so many different careers, you have a constant reference point for the career you're leading, and you get to, you're not just going into the same office every day and going, am I happy or am I not, with no context in terms of what that is. So I fundamentally believe that we all have an opportunity, skill set, time to create impact on the world around us, the world we care about. And we don't do that because we want to be nice, good people, but fundamentally we do it because of how it makes us feel. Like, our sense of identity and purpose is fundamentally important. When control is taken away from you, when things are going wrong, it's very easy for all the metaphoric arrows to be pointing in the way. So the more you can get the arrows pointing out the way, and you've got genuine connections within the communities you live, the salient issues of today and things you care about, I think the better, the better you're looking after your own mental well-being and health and a sense of purpose in the world. So, we all know a lot of people who live corporate careers and then regret not seeing their kids growing up, or live a certain life and think, well, I'll build in responsibilities to community and charities once I've got financial security and a bit more time in my diary. And I've always felt very, very strongly from day one that I want to sort of plan out each period of my life and go, what's most important? Like, what's the career defining, life affirming stuff, which you quite often do for quite selfish purposes. Like, these are the athletic endeavors, and therefore what are the films I'm going to create? And once you nail them down, not to confuse matters, because you don't want to start thinking, are you doing it for those secondary purposes first and foremost? Because then that'll take away from your best possible performance in what you're fundamentally doing. But then there is always a creative way to build in greater value. And I'm not being very succinct here, but that's always been there. It's always what I wanted to do. I didn't want to sort of compartmentalize my life. So I got to some point, in my mid 40s, 50s, and I was like, right, well, I'm okay, but I've missed my kids growing up and I've not actually been connected to the wider challenges in the world. And it's not, to repeat myself, a sense of duty or public duty. It's more a sense of like, I've always been interested in the world. That's why I studied economics and politics at university. It's a formative part of sort of who I was, and therefore to live my life in a silo and to not be connected to wider things I care about, I think would make me fundamentally less happy. So I think I do these things because they make they sort of justify the hard work. I don't know if any of that makes sense.
I think it does. I think you're saying it's part of your personality to want to do them. It's not a separate thing. It's not a graft on. It's not giving something back. It's a definition. It's a whole part and parcel of what you are doing.
But it's also hugely exciting. And I think that's maybe something we missed in that convoluted answer. I love joining dots. I love spotting opportunities. I love creating value. I spend my life just going, you need to speak to them. You need to do this, or okay, that's fantastic. And the more you help people around you, the more the world helps you. And that's just good business at the end of the day.
Or perhaps you could call it karma. I cannot say thank you enough to Mark. He fit me into a frankly crazy busy schedule and had the patience to put up with some probing questions. I assure you many people would not. What I didn't say is I am a fan. When I head to the Turbo Trainer on a dark winter morning, I often think of Mark, who did the same thing before his world ride, but was up much earlier and riding for much, much longer. Links to his new podcast, to other podcasts he's done, to his books, and that excellent audiobook we spoke about are in the show notes. And if you've enjoyed this, there's a link to buy me a virtual coffee, which helps with the hosting charges. There are also links at alwaysanotheradventure.com, where you'll find many other podcasts. I'm Simon Willis. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.